The British soldier, lying in a waterlogged foxhole near the Sittang River in Burma on February 22, 1942, could hear Japanese forces moving through the jungle approximately 200 yards to his east, the sounds of equipment clanking and voices speaking Japanese carrying clearly through the humid night air, despite the rain that had been falling steadily for hours, and that had turned the defensive positions into muddy pools, where soldiers crouched in water that reached their waists and that seeped into every piece of clothing and equipment. Private Thomas Bancroft of the 17th Indian Division's 1st Battalion, 7th Gurkha Rifles, had been retreating through Burma for 6 weeks since Japanese forces had invaded from Thailand in late January, falling back from position after position as Japanese forces, advancing with speed and tactical skill that shocked British commanders, drove British and Indian forces steadily northward toward the Indian border. And he understood that the Sittang River behind him represented a final major obstacle before the road to Rangoon lay open to Japanese forces who had demonstrated throughout the campaign that they could outflank any defensive position and that they were willing to accept casualties that British forces considered suicidal in pursuit of operational objectives. Bancroft's foxhole, if it could be called that, was a shallow depression approximately 2 feet deep that he had scraped into the muddy ground using his entrenching tool during the previous afternoon when the battalion had occupied positions covering the approach routes to the Sittang Bridge, approximately 1 mile to his rear. The position provided minimal protection from small arms fire and virtually no protection from artillery or mortar fire, with the water accumulated in the bottom making it impossible to sit or lie down without being submerged and forcing Bancroft to crouch in uncomfortable position that made his legs cramp and that left him exhausted even before combat began. His Lee Enfield rifle lay across the front edge of the foxhole, protected from the mud by being positioned on his haversack, but exposed to the rain that was steadily soaking everything despite attempts to keep equipment covered. The Burma Campaign, beginning in January 1942, when Japanese forces invaded Burma from Thailand, and extending until August 1945, when Japan surrendered, represented one of the longest and most difficult campaigns fought by British and Commonwealth forces during World War II, conducted across terrain and in climate that were as dangerous as the enemy, covering distances exceeding 1,000 miles from Burma's southern tip near Rangoon to the mountain borders with India and China, and involving forces from Britain, India, Burma, China, the United States, Japan, and various other nations fighting in conditions that tested human endurance beyond what soldiers in Europe or in other Pacific theaters experienced, and that created casualties from disease that exceeded casualties from combat throughout much of the campaign. Burma occupied strategic position between British India to the west and China to the north and east, with Thailand to the southeast, providing the invasion route that Japanese forces would use to enter Burma in pursuit of multiple strategic objectives, including capturing Rangoon's port facilities that handled much of Burma's external trade, cutting the Burma Road that carried supplies from India through Burma to Chinese nationalist forces fighting Japan and China, securing Burma's oil resources, including the Yenangyang oil fields that could supply Japanese military operations throughout Southeast Asia, and potentially using Burma as base for subsequent invasion of India that would threaten the British Empire's most valuable possession, and that might force Britain to negotiate peace if Indian defense proved impossible. The terrain was among the most challenging in the world for military operations, with mountain ranges including the Arakan Yomas and the mountains along the Indian border exceeding 10,000 feet in elevation and being covered with dense jungle that restricted visibility to yards, and that made navigation difficult, even with maps and compasses, with rivers including the Irrawaddy, the Sittang, and the Salween being major obstacles requiring bridges or boats to cross and becoming impassable during monsoon season when water levels rose by tens of feet, with dense jungle covering much of the country and restricting movement to roads and trails where ambushes were easy, and where mechanized forces could not maneuver off established routes, and with monsoon rains from May through October, turning roads into impassable mud and making air operations difficult due to low clouds and reduced visibility. The climate created conditions that were almost unbearable for troops from temperate regions, with temperatures exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit during the hot season from March through May, with humidity approaching 100%, making the heat feel even more oppressive and making any physical exertion exhausting, with monsoon rains creating constant wetness that caused skin to rot and equipment to rust, and with tropical diseases including malaria, dysentery, typhus, scrub typhus, and various other ailments being endemic, and creating casualty rates from disease that exceeded combat casualties throughout much of the campaign. The British Army's medical services were initially unprepared for tropical diseases and lacked adequate supplies of medicines including quinine and mepicrin for malaria treatment, leading to disease rates that incapacitated entire units and that reduced combat effectiveness more than enemy action did. The British forces defending Burma in January 1942 consisted of approximately 40,000 troops organized in the Burma Army under Lieutenant General Thomas Hutton, a force that included 2 British infantry battalions, several Indian Army brigades consisting of Indian, Gurkha, and Burmese troops raised and trained in India, the Burma Rifles, consisting of locally recruited Burmese soldiers whose loyalty would prove questionable when Japanese invaded, and various support units, including artillery, engineers, and service troops. The forces were inadequately equipped by standards of modern warfare that had been demonstrated in Europe and in North Africa, lacking tanks except for a few obsolescent light tanks that were mechanically unreliable, that were armed only with machine guns, lacking adequate artillery with many guns being World War I vintage that lacked modern fire control systems, lacking anti-aircraft guns despite Japanese air superiority being obvious from the campaign's beginning, and lacking the training and experience needed for jungle warfare, where tactics that worked in open terrain were ineffective. General Hutton understood from intelligence reports and from his own assessment that defending Burma against major Japanese offensive with the forces and resources available was probably impossible given Japanese numerical superiority, Japanese control of the air, Japanese experience in jungle warfare from campaigns in Malaya and China, and the inadequacy of British defensive preparations, including the lack of fortified positions and the absence of plans for conducting fighting withdrawal if forward positions could not be held. But political considerations demanded that Burma be defended rather than being abandoned without fighting, with Winston Churchill insisting that every effort be made to hold Rangoon and to maintain the Burma road supply line to China, with the British government in India demanding that Burma be held to prevent Japanese forces from reaching India's borders, and with Chinese Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek demanding British commitment to Burma's defense because Chinese forces were depending on supplies being delivered through Burma via the Burma Road. The defensive plan that Hutton developed called for defending southern Burma, including Rangoon, for as long as possible, while preparing fallback positions in central Burma, where retreating forces could establish defensive lines that would be shorter and potentially more defensible than the extended positions in southern Burma. But the plan depended on assumptions that proved invalid, including the assumption that reinforcements would arrive from India and from the Middle East in time to strengthen defenses before Japanese attacks developed, the assumption that the small Royal Air Force contingent in Burma could contest Japanese air superiority or at minimum could provide reconnaissance allowing British forces to track Japanese movements, and the assumption that Japanese forces would advance cautiously, allowing time for British forces to prepare defensive positions rather than advancing with the speed and aggressiveness that would characterize Japanese operations throughout the campaign. The Japanese forces invading Burma consisted of the 15th Army under Lieutenant General Shojiro Ida, an experienced officer who had commanded forces in China and who understood jungle warfare and mobile operations, with the army initially consisting of two divisions, the 33rd Division and the 55th Division, totaling approximately 35,000 troops at the campaign's beginning, but being reinforced to approximately 60,000 troops during subsequent months as additional units were committed to ensure rapid conquest of Burma. The Japanese forces possessed significant advantages, including extensive combat experience from years of fighting in China, where they had learned to operate in difficult terrain with minimal logistic support, air superiority through control of airfields in Thailand that allowed Japanese aircraft to operate over Burma without effective opposition, tanks including Type 95 Hago light tanks and Type 97 Chi-Ha medium tanks that were superior to anything British forces possessed in Burma, and tactical doctrine emphasizing speed, infiltration, and aggressive exploitation of any weakness in enemy defenses, rather than methodical advances that gave defenders time to prepare. The Japanese strategy for conquering Burma emphasized rapid advance along the main roads from Thailand toward Rangoon, before British forces could establish strong defensive positions, with mobile forces, including tanks and motorized infantry, advancing along roads, while infantry forces moved through jungle on parallel routes, outflanking British positions, and creating constant threat of encirclement that would force British withdrawals even when forward positions might have been held if flanks had been secure. The tactics included aggressive use of roadblocks established behind British positions by forces that had infiltrated through jungle, creating situations where British forces found their withdrawal routes blocked and where they had to fight their way out or be captured, and included psychological warfare elements such as loud announcements in English demanding surrender and playing music intended to demoralize defenders. The invasion began on January 20th, 1942, when Japanese forces crossed from Thailand into Burma at multiple points, including crossings near the Three Pagodas Pass and near Victoria Point at Burma's southern tip, with the initial objectives being to capture airfields that would allow Japanese air forces to operate throughout Burma and to secure the main roads that would carry the advance toward Rangoon. The initial British defensive positions at the border were quickly overwhelmed despite determined resistance from some units, with Japanese forces demonstrating tactical superiority through their aggressive tactics, through their willingness to accept casualties, and through their ability to coordinate infantry, armor, and air support in combined arms operations that British forces in Burma had not been trained to conduct or to defend against. The withdrawal from the border positions began within days of the invasion starting, establishing a pattern that would characterize the campaign for the next 4 months, as British and Indian forces repeatedly attempted to establish defensive lines, only to discover that Japanese forces had outflanked positions through movement along jungle trails that British intelligence had not identified or had dismissed as impassable, and being forced to withdraw before positions could be properly organized and before units could coordinate defensive fires with adjacent units. The psychological impact of continuous withdrawal was devastating for morale, with soldiers concluding that resistance was futile because every position would eventually be abandoned regardless of how well it was defended, and with officers losing confidence in higher headquarters competence when orders to hold positions at all costs were followed within days by orders to withdraw because flanks had been turned. Captain James Morrison, commanding a company of the 1st Battalion, the Gloucestershire Regiment, experienced the frustration of being ordered to defend positions that higher headquarters assured him were critical and that must be held, only to receive withdrawal orders within 24 hours when Japanese forces appeared on his flanks or in his rear, having moved through jungle that British maps showed as impassable swamp. Morrison's company had been reduced from authorized strength of approximately 120 men to perhaps 80 effectives through casualties and through disease, with malaria being endemic among the troops, despite attempts to enforce anti-malarial discipline, including taking daily doses of quinine that caused ringing in ears and other side effects that soldiers found nearly as unpleasant as malaria itself. The defensive position that Morrison's company occupied on February 10, 1942, near Martaban, covered a road junction that British intelligence had identified as critical to preventing Japanese advance toward the Sittang River, with the company being ordered to hold the position for at least 48 hours to allow other British forces to establish defensive lines further north. Morrison deployed his 3 rifle platoons to cover likely approaches while positioning his company headquarters in a pagoda that provided observation over surrounding terrain, and that offered some protection from small arms fire, though it would be obvious target for Japanese artillery or air attack if fighting developed. The company's defensive preparations included digging firing positions for rifles and for the company's 2 Bren light machine guns, positioning obstacles including barbed wire across likely approach routes, though wire was in short supply and the obstacles were less extensive than Morrison would have preferred, and registering artillery fire on potential target areas, though ammunition shortages meant that pre-registration fire was limited to noting landmarks for future fire missions, rather than actually firing the guns. The Japanese attack on Morrison's position began during the early afternoon of February 11th, when Japanese infantry supported by 3 tanks appeared on the road approaching from the south, advancing in column formation that suggested confidence that British resistance would be minimal or absent. Morrison ordered his men to hold fire until Japanese forces were within 300 yards, understanding that ammunition conservation was critical, and that achieving surprise through allowing Japanese forces to close before opening fire might compensate for British numerical inferiority and inferior weapons. The initial volley from British rifles and from the Bren guns achieved surprise, with Japanese infantry taking casualties and seeking cover, while the tanks continued advancing apparently unfazed by rifle fire that was ineffective against armor. The company's only anti-tank weapon was a Boy's anti-tank rifle, a .55 caliber weapon that was supposed to penetrate light tank armor at close range, but that had proven ineffective against Japanese tanks in previous engagements, with the weapon's bullets bouncing off tank armor or penetrating without causing significant damage. The Boy's rifle gunner fired at the lead Japanese tank from range of approximately 200 yards, achieving several hits that were visible as sparks where bullets struck armor, but that did not stop the tank or appear to cause any damage. The tank responded by traversing its turret toward the British position and firing high-explosive shells that detonated near the Boy's rifle position, killing the gunner and wounding 2 other soldiers who had been nearby. Morrison requested artillery support from battalion headquarters, providing coordinates for the Japanese position and requesting immediate fire, but was informed that artillery ammunition was severely rationed and that fire missions could be approved only when targets were considered critical and when significant Japanese forces were present. The refusal to provide artillery support despite the presence of Japanese tanks, and despite Morrison's assessment that his position would be overrun without fire support, reflected the ammunition shortages that plagued British forces throughout the 1942 campaign, with supply lines from India being inadequate to maintain combat consumption rates, and with no reserves accumulated because pre-war planning had not anticipated major combat operations in Burma. The decision to withdraw from the position was made by Morrison approximately 2 hours after the Japanese attack began, when it became clear that his company could not hold against Japanese forces that were being reinforced, and that had begun flanking movements through jungle on both sides of the road. Morrison ordered withdrawal by platoons, with one platoon providing covering fire, while the other two withdrew along a track leading north through jungle, then leapfrogging so the withdrawn platoons provided cover, while the rear platoon broke contact and withdrew. The withdrawal was conducted under fire, with Japanese forces pursuing and inflicting casualties on the rear platoon, including Morrison himself, who was wounded in the leg by rifle fire, but continued commanding until reaching positions where the battalion was assembling approximately 3 miles north of the original position. The Battle of the Sittang Bridge during February 22–23, 1942, represented the decisive engagement of the retreat toward Rangoon and the action that would determine whether British forces could establish defensive positions east of Rangoon or whether the capital would fall to Japanese forces advancing with minimal opposition. The 17th Indian Division under Major General John Smith had been assigned to defend positions covering the Sittang Bridge, the only crossing of the Sittang River for miles in either direction, and the final major obstacle before Rangoon for Japanese forces advancing from the east. Smythe's division had been reduced through casualties and through disease from authorized strength of approximately 17,000 to perhaps 12,000 effectives, with many units being under strength and with morale being poor after weeks of continuous retreat. The plan for defending the Sittang crossing called for the division to hold positions east of the river long enough for all divisional troops and equipment to cross the single bridge, which was a steel structure approximately 100 feet long spanning the river at a point where the river was approximately 200 yards wide and flowing swiftly. The bridge was prepared for demolition, with explosives being positioned at key structural points, with the charges being connected to detonators that would allow the bridge to be destroyed quickly if Japanese forces threatened to capture it intact. The timing for demolition was critical, with premature destruction trapping British forces on the wrong side of an uncrossable river, while delayed destruction might allow Japanese forces to capture the bridge and to advance directly toward Rangoon. Private Bancroft's battalion was positioned approximately 2 miles east of the bridge, covering one of the approach routes that Japanese forces might use, with orders to hold positions until ordered to withdraw and to fall back across the bridge when withdrawal orders were received. The battalion's defensive positions were inadequate despite the time available for preparation, with the monsoon season not yet begun, but with heavy rains during February making the ground waterlogged and making digging difficult, with the jungle providing concealment, but also limiting fields of fire and making observation of Japanese movements nearly impossible until they were very close. The battalion had 2 companies forward covering the expected Japanese approach routes, with 1 company in reserve and with battalion headquarters positioned approximately 500 yards behind the forward companies. The Japanese attack that would lead to the Sittang Bridge disaster began during the evening of February 22nd, when Japanese forces of unknown strength but estimated at brigade level or larger attacked the 17th Division's positions from multiple directions simultaneously, achieving penetrations through infiltration tactics where small groups of Japanese soldiers moved through jungle avoiding British positions and then attacking British rear areas from unexpected directions. The fighting during the night of February 22-23 was confused and chaotic, with units losing contact with adjacent units and with higher headquarters, with Japanese forces establishing roadblocks behind British positions, cutting withdrawal routes, and with British forces attempting to fight toward the bridge while being engaged from multiple directions. Bancroft's battalion was attacked around 2200 hours on February 22 by Japanese forces that approached through jungle without being detected until they were within grenade-throwing distance of British positions. The first indication of the attack was grenades exploding in forward company positions, followed immediately by rifle and machine gun fire from Japanese positions that had not been there minutes before. The forward companies attempted to return fire, but were hampered by darkness, by confusion about where Japanese forces were positioned, and by the rapidity of the Japanese assault that gave defenders no time to organize coordinated response. The order to withdraw came approximately 30 minutes after the attack began, transmitted by runner because radio communications had failed when the battalion's wireless set was damaged by Japanese fire. The withdrawal toward the bridge was supposed to be conducted in organized fashion with companies leapfrogging to provide mutual support, but the reality was that the withdrawal became a confused movement toward the rear, with units losing cohesion and with soldiers making their way toward the bridge individually or in small groups while being engaged by Japanese forces that seemed to be everywhere. Bancroft reached the bridge approach around 0400 hours on February 23 after approximately 5 hours of moving through jungle and across open ground while being shot at intermittently by Japanese forces who were also trying to reach the bridge. The scene at the bridge was chaotic, with hundreds of soldiers trying to cross simultaneously, with vehicles and equipment blocking the approaches because drivers had abandoned vehicles when they became stuck or when they were damaged by Japanese fire, and with wounded men being carried or being supported by comrades while other wounded who could not walk were left behind because carrying them would have blocked the bridge and prevented other men from crossing. The decision to blow the Sittang Bridge was made by Major General Smith around 05:30 hours on February 23, after receiving reports from officers at the bridge that Japanese forces were approaching and might capture the bridge intact within the next hour if demolition was delayed, and after agonizing over the fact that approximately 4,000 of his troops were still on the eastern bank fighting to reach the bridge or surrounded by Japanese forces. Smith understood that losing the bridge would be catastrophic because it would allow Japanese forces to cross the Sittang River unopposed and to advance directly toward Rangoon with nothing between them and the capital except disorganized remnants of his division. But he also understood that destroying the bridge would trap thousands of his men on the eastern bank where they would be killed or captured. The demolition charges were detonated at approximately 05:30 hours, with a series of explosions that destroyed several spans of the bridge and sent debris raining into the river, cutting off the escape route for thousands of British and Indian troops who were still on the eastern bank. Private Bancroft was among those trapped, having been delayed during the night by Japanese fire and by having to take cover multiple times, reaching the bridge approach approximately 10 minutes after the explosions, when it was clear that crossing was impossible, and that the only options were attempting to swim across the river, attempting to construct improvised rafts, or surrendering to Japanese forces who would arrive within hours. The crossing attempt that Bancroft made around 0700 hours on February 23rd involved stripping off his equipment except for his rifle, which he reluctantly abandoned because swimming with a rifle was impossible, wading into the river at a point approximately half a mile downstream from the destroyed bridge, where the current appeared slightly less violent, and attempting to swim across while being swept downstream by current that was stronger than it appeared from shore. Bancroft was a reasonably strong swimmer, having learned swimming in his youth in a river near his Yorkshire home. But the Sittang River was far more powerful than any river he had previously encountered, with the current being perhaps 5 or 6 knots, and with the distance across being approximately 200 yards of swimming while fighting to avoid being swept downstream into rapids that would certainly drown anyone caught in them. The swim took perhaps 15 minutes, though Bancroft's perception of time was distorted by exhaustion and by the terror of potentially drowning, with him being swept approximately half a mile downstream before reaching the western bank, where he crawled onto muddy shore and lay gasping for perhaps 30 minutes before having strength to move further inland. Other soldiers attempting to cross the river were visible both upstream and downstream, some making successful crossings and others disappearing beneath the surface and not reappearing, drowning in the swift current or being pulled under by equipment they had not removed, or simply lacking the strength to swim in conditions that tested even strong swimmers. The casualties from the Sittang Bridge disaster exceeded 50% of the 17th. Indian Division's strength, with approximately 3,000 men being killed, captured, or missing, presumed drowned, and with virtually all the division's heavy equipment, including artillery pieces, vehicles, communications equipment, and most small arms being lost on the eastern bank, where they were captured intact by Japanese forces or were destroyed by British troops attempting to deny them to the enemy. The division's remaining troops, perhaps 6,000 men who successfully crossed the river, were exhausted, demoralized, and largely unarmed, reducing the division to ineffective remnant that would require months to rebuild and that would not participate meaningfully in subsequent operations during the 1942 campaign. The fall of Rangoon on March 8, 1942, followed inevitably from the disaster at Sittang Bridge, with British forces lacking the strength to defend the capital against Japanese forces that had crossed the Sittang and that were advancing rapidly up the roads toward Rangoon with minimal opposition. General Harold Alexander, who had replaced Hutton as commander of British forces in Burma during early March, assessed the situation and concluded that attempting to defend Rangoon would result in British forces being trapped in the city and destroyed without affecting the strategic outcome, and that withdrawing forces northward would preserve them for future operations and would allow establishment of defensive positions in central Burma, where terrain favored defense and where reinforcements from India might strengthen the position. The evacuation of Rangoon was conducted during March 5-8, with military forces withdrawing northward along the roads leading toward Mandalay, and with demolition teams destroying port facilities, oil storage tanks containing thousands of tons of petroleum products, military installations including arsenals and barracks, and the railway yards where locomotives and rolling stock were destroyed to prevent their use by Japanese forces. The demolitions created enormous fires that burned for days, with smoke being visible for miles, and with the destruction ensuring that Japanese forces would capture a city whose economic and military value had been largely eliminated. The civilian population of Rangoon, which had numbered approximately 400,000 before the war, but which had been swollen with refugees from fighting in southern Burma, and which had been reduced by evacuations that had begun in January, largely remained in the city because transportation was inadequate for mass evacuation, and because many people calculated that remaining in their homes under Japanese occupation would be safer than fleeing into uncertain conditions in northern Burma, where food, shelter, and security would be problematic. The retreat from Rangoon to Mandalay and eventually to the Indian border during March, April, and early May 1942 represented one of the longest retreats in British military history, covering approximately 1,000 miles through some of the most difficult terrain in the world during the hottest months of the year, when temperatures exceeded 110 degrees Fahrenheit in some areas, and during the early monsoon season when roads became nearly impassable from mud and when rivers flooded, making crossings dangerous or impossible without bridges. Lieutenant General William Slim, who assumed command of Burma Corps consisting of the remnants of British forces in Burma during the retreat, would later describe the operation as the longest retreat in British history, and one of the most difficult operations he ever commanded, comparing it unfavorably to fighting in North Africa and in Europe, where terrain and climate were far more favorable and where logistics were more reliable. The retreat was characterized by continuous rearguard actions where British and Indian forces attempted to delay Japanese advances while the main body withdrew by destruction of bridges and infrastructure to impede Japanese pursuit, by constant casualties from disease as malaria and dysentery incapacitated soldiers at rates exceeding combat casualties, and by gradual disintegration of units as soldiers became separated during night movements or during combat actions, and as discipline eroded under stress of continuous retreat without apparent purpose beyond surviving another day. Captain Morrison, who had been wounded during the February fighting and who had returned to duty despite not being fully recovered, commanded his company during the retreat as it was reduced from 80 men to perhaps 40 effectives, with the losses being approximately half from disease and half from combat, and with the survivors being exhausted physically and psychologically to points where simply continuing to march required willpower that exceeded normal human capacity. The Chinese forces that entered Burma during March and April 1942, attempting to assist British defense and to protect the Burma Road, complicated an already difficult situation by operating under separate command, by pursuing objectives that sometimes conflicted with British priorities, and by creating coordination problems when Chinese and British forces were operating in the same areas without effective mechanisms for communication or for coordinating operations. Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek commanded Chinese forces from his headquarters in Chongqing in China, communicating with his field commanders through radio networks that British forces could not access, and making strategic decisions without consulting British commanders whose forces were fighting alongside Chinese units. American Lieutenant General Joseph Stilwell, serving as Chiang's chief of staff and attempting to coordinate Chinese and British operations, found the task nearly impossible due to mutual suspicion between British and Chinese commanders, due to language barriers, and due to fundamental differences in tactical doctrine and operational approaches. The Chinese forces entering Burma numbered approximately 100,000 troops organized in 3 armies, the 5th Army, the 6th Army, and the 66th Army, representing numerically substantial forces that should have been able to assist materially in defending Burma against Japanese forces that were outnumbered by the combined Chinese-British strength. But the Chinese forces were poorly equipped by modern standards, lacking adequate artillery, lacking tanks, lacking motor transport, meaning the troops and supplies moved on foot or by pack animal, and being supplied through logistics systems that were inadequate even by Chinese standards, meaning the Chinese troops often operated on minimal rations and with ammunition shortages that limited their combat effectiveness. The Chinese commanders were primarily concerned with preserving their forces for eventual use in China's civil war between nationalists and communists, rather than committing them fully to defending Burma, leading to cautious tactics and to withdrawals when aggressive action might have achieved better results. The Battle of Yananyang in mid-April 1942 demonstrated both the potential for Chinese-British cooperation and the difficulties of achieving effective coordination in practice. The British 1st Burma Division had been surrounded by Japanese forces near the Yananyang oil fields in central Burma, with approximately 7,000 British and Indian troops being cut off from retreat routes and facing destruction or capture when Chinese forces under General Sun Li-jen launched attacks against Japanese positions and opened an escape corridor, allowing the British division to withdraw. The Chinese attack was conducted aggressively, with Sun's troops accepting significant casualties to break through Japanese positions, demonstrating that Chinese forces could fight effectively when properly led and motivated. But the rescue could not change the overall strategic situation, where Allied forces were being steadily pushed northward by Japanese forces that retained initiative. The destruction of the Yananyang oil fields before their capture represented British adherence to scorched earth policy that would be employed throughout the retreat, with engineers setting fires in oil wells and storage facilities that created enormous columns of black smoke visible for dozens of miles, and that denied Japan access to oil resources that might have been used to support operations in Burma or elsewhere in Southeast Asia. The fires burned for weeks, with some wells continuing to burn for months because firefighting equipment was unavailable and because Japanese forces who captured the area lacked resources to extinguish the fires. The destruction of Burma's economic infrastructure, including oil fields, refineries, railways, and port facilities, would make eventual Allied return to Burma more difficult, and would leave Burma's economy devastated for years after the war ended. But British commanders calculated that denying resources to Japan was more important than preserving infrastructure for post-war reconstruction. The fighting withdrawal through central Burma during April and early May 1942 saw British, Indian, Chinese, and remaining Burmese forces conducting continuous rearguard actions attempting to delay Japanese advances, with some actions being conducted skillfully by units that maintained discipline and combat effectiveness despite the retreat's hardships, and with other actions degenerating into poorly coordinated withdrawals under fire, where units lost cohesion and where only individual courage and initiative prevented complete collapse. Sergeant Edwards of the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry commanded a platoon providing rear guard during the withdrawal through Schwegen in late April, holding positions covering a river crossing for 4 hours while being attacked by Japanese forces before withdrawing across the bridge just before engineers destroyed it, an action that was typical of dozens of similar engagements where small units held briefly and then withdrew before being encircled, buying hours rather than days, but cumulatively allowing the main body to continue retreating toward India. The march through the mountains toward India during May as monsoon rains began represented the retreat's most difficult phase, with roads deteriorating into muddy trails that vehicles could not navigate, and where supplies had to be carried by porters or abandoned, with monsoon rains turning trails into streams and creating landslides that blocked routes, forcing detours through even more difficult terrain, with soldiers suffering from malaria and dysentery, being unable to march without assistance, meaning that healthy soldiers had to support or carry sick comrades while also carrying their own equipment, and while maintaining vigilance against Japanese forces that pursued retreating columns. The casualties during this phase exceeded casualties from earlier fighting, with hundreds dying from disease, from exhaustion, from falls from mountain trails where one misstep meant tumbling hundreds of feet down slopes, and from Japanese attacks on columns that were strung out along trails where mutual support was impossible. Private Bancroft, who had survived the Sittang Bridge crossing and who had rejoined his unit during the retreat, contracted malaria during the march through the mountains, experiencing fever that reached 105 degrees Fahrenheit, experiencing hallucinations where he saw things that were not there, and being unable to march without support from comrades who half carried him along trails, while encouraging him to continue walking, and while telling him that reaching India meant survival, while stopping meant death. The malaria would recur periodically for years after the war, with Bancroft experiencing attacks every few months where fever and weakness would incapacitate him for days, legacy of service in Burma that would affect him for the remainder of his life. The arrival of British and Indian forces at Imphal in India during mid-May 1942 marked the end of the retreat from Burma, with approximately 12,000 troops reaching India as organized units, while perhaps another 10,000 arrived as stragglers over subsequent weeks, and while thousands more were listed as missing, presumed killed or captured, or having died during the retreat from disease or exhaustion. The forces that reached India were exhausted, diseased, and largely unarmed, having lost most heavy equipment during the retreat, requiring months of rest and refitting before they could return to combat operations. General Slim, who would command these forces as they were reorganized into the 14th Army, understood that rebuilding would require not just replacing equipment and reinforcing units with fresh troops, but also rebuilding morale and restoring confidence that had been shattered by months of continuous defeat. The period from May 1942 through late 1943 saw the front lines stabilizing along the Indian-Burmese border while both sides rebuilt forces, with British forces reorganizing and training for eventual offensive operations, with Japanese forces consolidating their hold on Burma and preparing defensive positions, and with both sides conducting limited offensive operations, including the First Arakan Campaign during late 1942 and early 1943, that saw British forces attempting to advance into the Arakan region of western Burma and being defeated by Japanese forces that demonstrated continued tactical superiority. The first Chindit expedition, led by Brigadier Ord Wingate during early 1943, represented British attempt to take war into Japanese-held Burma through long-range penetration operations behind Japanese lines, operations that would be supplied by air and that would conduct sabotage and gather intelligence while demonstrating that British forces could operate in jungle as effectively as Japanese forces. The Chindits, named after the Chintha mythical creature that guards Burmese temples, consisted of approximately 3,000 troops organized into columns that would march deep into Burma, crossing rivers and mountain ranges to reach targets including the Mandalay-Myitkyina Railway that was Japan's main supply line in northern Burma. The first Chindit operation, beginning in February 1943, achieved limited tactical success, including destruction of several railway bridges and viaducts that disrupted Japanese supply operations for weeks, and gathered intelligence about Japanese positions and about terrain in areas where British forces had not operated since the 1942 retreat, but suffered approximately 30% casualties, including approximately 1,000 men killed, captured, or missing presumed dead during the withdrawal to India, when Chindit columns had to march hundreds of miles through Japanese-held territory, while being pursued by Japanese forces attempting to destroy them. The second Chindit operation during 1944 was conducted on larger scale with approximately 20,000 troops organized. In 6 brigades that would be flown into Burma by glider and transport aircraft rather than marching in from India, an operation that would establish bases deep in Burma from which Chindit columns would operate against Japanese supply lines and communications. The operation achieved more substantial results than the first expedition, including establishing bases that disrupted Japanese operations for months and tying down Japanese forces that had to be diverted to deal with Chindit threat. But casualties again exceeded 30%, including Wingate himself, who was killed when the aircraft carrying him crashed in jungle during March 1944, depriving the Chindits of the charismatic leader whose vision had created the force and whose determination had driven operations despite skepticism from conventional military leaders who questioned whether long-range penetration operations achieved results justifying their costs. The Battle of Imphal Kohima during March through July 1944 represented the turning point of the Burma Campaign, when Japanese forces attempted to invade India through coordinated attacks on Imphal and Kohima. Positions controlling routes into India and threatening to cut the Ledo Road that was being constructed to provide supply route to China after the Burma Road had been cut by Japanese occupation. Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi, commanding the Japanese 15th Army, planned Operation Yugo as decisive offensive that would destroy British forces in the Imphal area, would capture supply dumps that would sustain Japanese operations, and would advance into India, where Japanese propaganda claimed that Indian population would rise against British rule and would support Japanese liberation of India continue from colonial oppression. The Japanese 15th Army committed approximately 85,000 troops, organized in 3 divisions, to Operation Yugo, forces that would advance through mountain jungles from Burma toward Imphal and Kohima, following routes that British intelligence had identified as possible, but that British commanders considered impractical for large-scale operations due to the terrain's difficulty and due to logistics problems of supplying forces advancing through roadless mountains. The Japanese accepted these difficulties, calculating that surprise would be achieved and that rapid advance would allow capture of British supply dumps before British forces could destroy them, providing supplies that would sustain Japanese operations after their own supply lines had been stretched to breaking point. The siege of Kohima, beginning in early April 1944, saw approximately 1,500 British and Indian troops defending the town against Japanese forces numbering initially approximately 15,000, but being reinforced to perhaps 20,000 as additional Japanese units arrived to press attacks on positions that British forces defended, with determination born from understanding that losing Kohima would cut the road to Imphal and would isolate British forces there. The fighting at Kohima occurred at close quarters, with some positions being separated by only yards, with the famous tennis court battle seeing Japanese and British forces fighting across a tennis court that had been built by British colonial administrators before the war, and that now became front line, where soldiers from both sides occupied bunkers on opposite sides of the court lobbing grenades, and firing at enemies visible across the court, and where the white lines marking tennis boundaries became boundaries between life and death. The relief of Kohima on April 18th by the British 2nd Division advancing from Dimapur broke the siege, but did not end the battle, with fighting continuing around Kohima for another 2 months as British forces attempted to drive Japanese forces from positions in the hills surrounding the town, and as Japanese forces launched repeated counterattacks attempting to recapture positions they had lost. The intensity of fighting exceeded anything British forces had experienced in Burma to that point, with some units suffering 50% casualties during the weeks of continuous combat, and with Japanese forces accepting even higher casualties in human wave attacks that British machine gunners and artillery crews repelled through volumes of fire that created piles of Japanese bodies in front of British positions. Lance Corporal John Harmon of the Queen's Own Royal West Kent Regiment earned the Victoria Cross for actions at Kohima on April 8th and 9th when he single-handedly attacked Japanese bunkers and machine gun positions that were holding up British advances, killing numerous Japanese soldiers in close combat and destroying several positions before being killed by Japanese fire while returning from his final attack. Harmon's citation described actions that exceeded normal bounds of courage, attacking enemy positions alone under heavy fire and continuing to attack even when wounded, actions that inspired his comrades and that contributed to breaking Japanese attacks that might otherwise have overwhelmed British defenses. The Battle of Imphal occurred simultaneously with Kohima, with Japanese forces besieging Imphal from March through July 1944, while approximately 155,000 British and Indian troops defending the town were supplied entirely by air, using transport aircraft flying from India and landing at airfields around Imphal that engineers kept operational despite Japanese artillery fire, and despite monsoon rains that turned runways into mud. The air supply operation represented logistical achievement comparable to the Berlin airlift, with transport aircraft delivering approximately 19,000 tons of supplies and approximately 12,000 reinforcements during the 4-month siege, while evacuating approximately 13,000 wounded and approximately 43,000 non-combatants, including civilians and rear area personnel whose presence would have consumed supplies needed by fighting troops. The Japanese attacks on Imphal achieved initial success, capturing some outlying positions and advancing to within artillery range of the town. But the attacks could not break through main British defensive lines that were organized in depth and that were supported by armor, by artillery, and by air power that Japanese forces could not match. The siege conditions created hardships for defenders who were restricted to positions around Imphal and who could not maneuver freely. But Japanese forces suffered far worse conditions as their supply lines stretched across mountain jungles and as monsoon rains made resupply increasingly difficult and eventually impossible, forcing Japanese troops to subsist on minimal rations and creating starvation conditions that killed soldiers as surely as British fire killed them. The Japanese withdrawal from Imphal and Kohima, beginning in early July 1944, when Mutaguchi finally acknowledged that Operation Ugo had failed, became a catastrophe as starving and disease-ridden Japanese troops retreated through monsoon rains along trails that had become rivers of mud, with thousands dying from starvation, from disease including malaria and dysentery, from exhaustion, and from British air attacks on retreating columns. The trails along the withdrawal routes became littered with bodies of Japanese soldiers who had collapsed and died, creating scenes that British forces, advancing after the Japanese retreat, described as horrifying, even though the dead were enemies, with one British officer estimating that he passed bodies of dead Japanese soldiers every few yards along miles of trail. The total Japanese casualties during Operation Ugo exceeded 53,000, killed or missing from the 85,000 troops committed to the offensive, representing approximately 62% casualties that destroyed the Japanese 15th Army as effective fighting force, and that removed the Japanese threat to India. British casualties totaled approximately 17,000, killed, wounded, or missing, heavy losses but sustainable, and being replaced through reinforcements arriving from India and from Britain as the 14th Army was built up for eventual offensive operations that would liberate Burma. The Allied offensive operations during 1944 and 1945 that eventually liberated Burma employed combined operations by the British 14th Army, advancing from India under General Slim's command, by Chinese forces advancing from Yunnan province in China, supported by American advisors and by American air power, and by American-trained Chinese forces, and by American units, including Merrill's Marauders operating in northern Burma, capturing the critical airfield at Myitkyina that allowed air supply operations into China and that opened land routes for eventual construction of the Ledo Road connecting India to China. The operations demonstrated that Allied forces had learned lessons from the 1942 disaster with vastly improved training for jungle warfare that prepared soldiers for conditions they would face, with adequate supplies being delivered by air when ground supply routes were cut or were inadequate, with effective close air support that compensated for lack of armored vehicles in much of Burma's jungle terrain, and with leadership under General Slim that emphasized maintaining morale, ensuring adequate medical care, including effective anti-malarial measures that reduced disease casualties dramatically compared to 1942, and explaining operational plans to soldiers so they understood why their actions mattered and how their sacrifices contributed to eventual victory. The recapture of Mandalay in March 1945, following the Battle of Meghtila, where British forces captured the town that was central Burma's main Japanese supply base, represented the decisive operations that broke Japanese resistance in central Burma, and that opened the route toward Rangoon. The advance toward Rangoon during April and May was conducted as race against monsoon season that would make operations impossible, with British forces advancing faster than Japanese forces could organize effective resistance, and with Japanese forces withdrawing toward southern Burma or toward Thailand, attempting to avoid encirclement. The amphibious landing near Rangoon on May 1, 1945, designated Operation Dracula, and conducted by forces that had been training in India for amphibious operations, captured Rangoon before Japanese forces could organize defenses, reuniting seaborne forces with the 14th Army advancing overland from the north and completing the liberation of Burma 3 years after the disastrous retreat of 1942. The Burma Campaign from January 1942 to August 1945 cost Allied forces approximately 71,000 killed or missing and approximately 200,000 wounded or incapacitated by disease from British, Indian, Chinese, American, and other Allied forces, suffering casualties throughout 3.5 years of continuous operations in conditions that tested human endurance beyond normal limits. Japanese casualties exceeded 185,000 killed and approximately 100,000 wounded or captured, representing near total destruction of Japanese forces in Burma, and demonstrating that Allied superiority in supplies, in air power, and in logistics could overcome Japanese tactical skill and Japanese willingness to accept casualties that exceeded anything Allied forces would accept. The longest campaign fought by British Commonwealth forces during World War II demonstrated that victory in jungle warfare required not just tactical competence, but also logistical mastery, effective air power, and leadership that could maintain morale during years of difficult fighting in conditions where disease killed more soldiers than enemy action, and where simply surviving required courage and endurance that exceeded what was required in more forgiving theaters.